is a very commonly recognized model of aggregate demand, aggregate supply, and we'll explain what it means that it's from a neoclassical perspective. A neoclassical perspective in one sentence is that these group of economists all believe that wages are flexible. They believe they could go up and they could go down with relative ease in what's called the short run. Remember, the short run is the short run economics. There's this period of time where we say only some of the factors of production are flexible. We agree that labor is flexible, but things like capital, like the size of the factory, the way that it expands, is not flexible in the same way. It is in the long run, but not in the short run. And so this is sort of the conundrum that neoclassical economists explain. And so we have talked about before, we have this equilibrium and we call this Y1. For sakes, we'll just call it average price levels on the side. It's sort of a measure of how prices change, also indicated by inflation. This axis shows the idea of economic growth, and we label this with real GDP on the bottom axis. And so what typically happens, say in an economy, is we might get this period of time when aggregate demand increases. And remember, that could be to do with any old factor. It could be to do with changes in interest rates, could be to do with government spending, changes in consumer confidence, all those kind of determinants of aggregate demand. And remember from before, aggregate demand is to do with these kind of four net exports, imports, these kind of components of what we call aggregate demand. And depending on these changing and the injections and withdrawals, this curve is the one that's shifting on the side. And so you say, well, okay, so this is the first thing that happens is we get this increase of aggregate demand in the economy. But you think, well, and as a result of this, we get our price level increasing on the other axis. So we have, and it's to do with, well, as we kind of creep up this aggregate supply curve, this is what happens with firms are producing, is the cost of producing more and more does increase to do with the idea of scarcity. They do have to pay slightly more to expand their business. They do need to pay slightly more to attract workers. Maybe the cost of raw materials start increasing. And so that's a reflection of this price level going up on the side axis, and we call that inflation. But it's good though, and the consequence of inflation is that we have this period of economic growth on the bottom axis. But the thing we have to think about is what happens to workers? Well, according to neoclassical, we think wages are kind of flexible. They will go up and down. And workers realize this issue that we talk about over here. And this issue here, for them, relates back to this idea of purchasing power. And if these workers are on, say, if they're in, say, $500 per week, this inflation here is eroding this wage they receive. Call this a nominal wage that's not adjusted for inflation. So say if this even goes up by 2% in a year, their money is buying less than it did in the previous years. So constant inflation erodes purchasing power, and what workers will do is they'll start to demand higher wages. Over time, they will be successful in getting these higher wages through union power, etc. So firstly, aggregate demand increasing. Secondly, this idea of purchasing power and the idea of wages having to increase. So if wages do increase, the third thing to think about what happens as well, that does affect what the firm's cost of production. Labour for most firms is kind of an essential part of what they do, and this flows on to how much the firm is willing to supply. And therefore we get this situation of where we shift back, aggregate supply shifts back because of the higher cost of production. We can draw another arrow here. It's the third thing that happens. And so what you get happening is actually we're all back to the same point. We're back to this point of what we call Y1. We can draw a little line. That's big and green. through the middle of here. Growth did increase, growth did go back. We haven't really changed the amount of output in the economy. All that's happened is we've had 2 significant increases in the price level. Now we're up to, say, price level 3, the second increase in price level up the top. And this kind of wage spiral is why the neoclassical economists think that whatever happens in government spending, changes in consumer confidence, whatever happens is that the economy will kind of revert back to this point of its long-run potential. We call this sometimes YP, as the potential output for the economy. And this here, this vertical line, is often called, from a neoclassical perspective, the long-run aggregate supply curve. Changing demand is not going to change the amount that's produced in the economy. The only way of changing stuff in the economy is to actually increase the capacity of the economy. So by doing other things like increasing migration, the discovery of new resources and technology might shift this curve this way, which will increase growth. So this is kind of the explanation of what's called the neoclassical in the same way. But really quickly, it works in reverse. So you think, well, if for some reason there was a recession coming back the other way, consumer confidence was falling, draw my prices here. This is my first price level 1, equilibrium, Y1. This is our new one, PL2. So aggregate demand's fallen for some reason. The government spending perhaps has decreased down this way. And we know, like, in the short run, really, it can't really change wages quickly. But what does happen is, in the long run, is these firms here will compensate. So you can see down the bottom, we're producing less output. The firms will compensate and start to they'll compensate for lower output and decrease wages. So we'll get this shift kind of back this direction here. And then, as you notice, that we're kind of back at the same point again as before. So we've gone down, draw another curve in the middle, down the middle here, called long run aggregate supply. So in the short run, we can shift this way temporarily, but as wages get adjusted, we fall back to this long run point. Same as what happened before is that, in the short run, we can temporarily pay workers higher wages, but over time, this idea coming back to the equilibrium is the foundation of what's called neoclassical economics things. So I hope that kind of explained aggregate supply and aggregate demand in more depth. You might have also realized that some ideas from other lessons is that this idea here, when we fall below the equilibrium this way, and on this side when we fall above the equilibrium, that's 2 other concepts. When we temporarily go above our potential, it's called an inflationary gap. It's this gap down the bottom, but it's leading to inflation up the side. This one here is usually called a deflationary gap. I kind of also call it a recessionary gap. We have this effect down the bottom. We have price levels falling at the same time on that side. And this is the explanation of how these 2 things are resolved over time.